You have a friend who would do anything for you. Cancel plans, answer calls at midnight, absorb your worst moods without complaint. You've watched them run themselves into the ground for years. And privately, you would never say this out loud. You find them slightly exhausting to be around. Not because they're unpleasant, because there's something hollow underneath all that giving. Like talking to someone who's reading from a script they've memorized so thoroughly they've forgotten it isn't their own voice. You've never told them this, but you felt it. Here's the uncomfortable part. Some people in your life feel that way about you, not because you're a bad person, because you've been performing generosity so long that the performance has replaced the person. You stopped being someone who gives because they have something real to offer. You became someone who gives because stopping feels dangerous. Because somewhere early on, you learned that being useful was safer than being yourself. I understood this intellectually for years before I actually felt it. Knew the framework, could explain the psychology, still spent most of my 30s making myself available for things that had nothing to do with what I actually cared about. The knowing and the doing turned out to be in completely different zip codes. This book is about closing that distance, not by becoming selfish, by becoming real, by rebuilding the internal architecture that chronic accommodation quietly dismantled. The clarity about what you actually want, the confidence that doesn't depend on being needed, the capacity to give from surplus rather than debt. The most useful thing you can do for the people you love is stop being someone they can see through. That starts here. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The Good Person Con. The person who never says no isn't generous. They're afraid. There's a difference and everyone knows it except them. Watch closely and you can spot them anywhere. They're the one who volunteers before being asked, who laughs a little too quickly at someone else's joke, who shrinks slightly when they walk into a room. Not from shyness, but from habit. They've learned, over many years, that taking up less space makes things go smoother. So they got efficient at it. They made it automatic. They also made it their identity. Here's how the con works. From the time you were small, you were handed a story about what good people do. Good people sacrifice. Good people put others first. Good people don't complain, don't demand, don't inconvenience anyone with the full weight of their actual needs. You absorbed this story the way children absorb everything, completely, uncritically, without realizing you had the option to push back. So you became good, reliably, exhaustingly good. And the con is this. That story was never about making you a better person. It was about making you easier to manage. I remember sitting across from someone at dinner, sharp person, successful by every visible measure, who spent 45 minutes explaining why their boss's priorities had to come before their own project deadline. They weren't asking for advice. They were building a case, gathering evidence for a verdict they'd already reached, that their needs were the inconvenient ones. They'd been building that case their entire adult life. The selflessness trap has a particular cruelty to it. Unlike most psychological patterns that feel bad from the start, this one feels noble. It comes with social rewards. People praise you for it. They call you dependable, generous, easy to work with. They hand you more responsibilities because you never complain. And for a while, sometimes a long while, the praise is enough. Then it isn't. Then you start to notice the shape of your resentment, how it arrives quietly, without warning, when you're doing something entirely ordinary. Washing dishes at someone else's house, answering a message you don't have the energy to answer, saying, of course, when every part of you wanted to say, actually, no. The resentment isn't a character flaw, it's a receipt. It's your psyche handing you documentation of every transaction you completed at a loss and told yourself was fine. Here's what nobody explains about chronic self-erasure. It doesn't make you more valuable to the people around you. Over time, it makes you less valuable because the version of you they're interacting with is increasingly hollow. You're performing generosity rather than offering it. You're running an act that used to be genuine, but has since become maintenance. And people feel that. They may not name it, but they feel it. There's also a second layer to the con, darker and less discussed. When you organize your entire identity around being needed, you develop a quiet investment in other people's helplessness. You need them to need you, because without that dynamic, you're not sure what you are. This isn't love. This is a business arrangement disguised as love. You provide constant availability and accommodation. They provide you with a sense of purpose and worth. Everyone agrees not to examine the terms. It's codependency with better PR. The way out is not to become selfish. The way out is to become honest about what you're actually doing and why. When you say yes to something you want to say no to, ask yourself, who benefits from this? And what do I get in return? Not in a transactional, cold way, in an accurate way. Because accuracy is what's been missing. You've been running on a story that says sacrifice is inherently virtuous. But sacrifice without discernment isn't virtue. It's just loss. Real generosity comes from surplus. It comes from someone who has built something internally. Confidence, clarity, genuine capability, and chooses to share it because they have it to give. That's completely different from someone who gives compulsively because they don't know how to stop, or because stopping feels dangerous. The difference in impact is enormous. One elevates the people around them. The other simply keeps them comfortable. Think about the people who have actually changed your life. Not the ones who were always available, the ones who were worth listening to. They probably weren't martyrs. They probably had opinions, boundaries, things they refused to do. They probably said no sometimes, and meant it, and didn't apologize for meaning it. That's not coincidence. That's the pattern. The good person con ends the moment you decide that the most important standard you need to meet is your own. Not because other people don't matter, they do, but because you cannot build anything real, not a skill, not a relationship, not a life, while constantly burning the materials to keep someone else warm. You're allowed to keep some of it. You're allowed to build something. Chapter 2. The bank account you've been ignoring. You've been spending money you don't have. Not financial money, the other kind. The kind that, when it's gone, doesn't just make you broke. It makes you mean. You know the feeling. It arrives around 3 p.m. on a Wednesday, or at the end of a conversation that required more of you than you had available. It's not sadness exactly. It's not anger. It's a specific flatness. Like a phone at 4% battery that's technically still on, but not really functioning. You push through it. You have things to do. And you tell yourself that rest is coming, eventually, when things slow down. Things don't slow down. They never slow down. You just get better at ignoring the warnings. This is the part of the conversation most people skip. They talk about goals, habits, mindset, all of which matter, but skip the foundational question. Do you actually have the energy to execute any of this? Because you can have the clearest vision in the world and still accomplish nothing if you're running the whole operation on fumes. Energy is not motivational. It's not a feeling you summon by wanting it badly enough. It's a resource. Finite, depletable, and, this is the part people resist, something you are entirely responsible for managing. Most people manage it the way they'd manage money if they had no budget, no tracking, and a vague sense that more would arrive somehow. They spend freely, give generously to anyone who asks, and are perpetually surprised when there's nothing left at the end of the day for the things that actually matter to them. I did this for longer than I'd like to admit. Said yes to every request that came in, treated my own projects as things I'd get to later, and then wondered why later kept getting pushed to a time that never arrived. The account wasn't just depleted. I'd been overdrawn so long, I'd forgotten what a positive balance felt like. Here's what energy economics actually looks like in practice. Every interaction you have is a transaction. Every decision you make, every problem you solve for someone, every conversation you stay in past the point of genuine interest, all of it costs something. The bill isn't always obvious. It doesn't arrive immediately, but it accumulates with the quiet consistency of interest on debt. And like debt, the longer you ignore it, the worse the math gets. The first thing energy awareness requires is honesty about what actually costs you versus what pays you back. This sounds obvious. It isn't. Most people have never seriously examined the difference because they've been too busy just getting through the day. They operate on autopilot, saying yes to whatever arrives, and treating exhaustion as a universal condition rather than a specific consequence of specific choices. But when you start paying attention, really paying attention, patterns emerge. You'll notice that certain conversations leave you sharper afterward. Certain projects seem to generate momentum rather than consume it. Certain people, for reasons you might not be able to fully articulate, make you feel more like yourself when you're around them, rather than less. And then there are the others. The meeting that could have been an email, and everyone knew it, but nobody said so. The relationship where you do 80% of the emotional labor, and have quietly accepted that as the arrangement. The obligation you agreed to months ago for reasons that made sense at the time, and now sits on your calendar like a tax you forgot to appeal. None of these are dramatic. That's what makes them dangerous. They don't announce themselves as energy drains. They just quietly pull from the account, one small withdrawal at a time, until you reach for something and find the well unexpectedly dry. The people who manage their energy well are not doing anything mysterious. They're just doing something most people don't. They're treating their attention and capacity as genuinely scarce. They are selective in a way that can look from the outside like coldness. It isn't coldness. It's accuracy. There's a quality that high-output people share, across fields, across personality types, and it's this. They are ruthless about protecting the conditions under which they do their best work. They know which environments sharpen them and which ones dull them. They know which relationships refill them and which ones drain them dry. They structure their lives around that knowledge without apology. They don't feel guilty about it. That's the part worth noticing, because most people do feel guilty. They feel guilty for not being more available, for turning down requests, for leaving early, for choosing their own restoration over someone else's immediate convenience. This guilt is the final mechanism of the con. It ensures that even when you intellectually understand energy economics, you keep spending anyway, because the emotional cost of not spending feels higher in the moment. It isn't higher. It just feels that way because the consequences of depletion are delayed while the discomfort of saying no is immediate. Your brain is terrible at weighing those two things against each other. You have to do it manually, deliberately, until it becomes instinct. What that looks like in practice is simpler than it sounds. Before you say yes to something, you ask one question. Is this an investment or a withdrawal? Not morally. Not in terms of whether it's a good thing to do. Purely in terms of your energy account. Will this leave you with more capacity or less? Some withdrawals are worth making. Necessary ones, meaningful ones. ones that serve something larger than immediate comfort. The point isn't to stop giving. The point is to stop giving unconsciously, without accounting for the cost, without ensuring the account can sustain it. Because here's what changes when your energy account is actually healthy. Your thinking gets clearer, your work gets better, your relationships improve, not because you're giving more, but because what you're giving is genuinely yours to give. You stop being the kind of tired that makes you sharp, and start being the kind of rested that makes you generous without resentment. That's the goal. Not endless output. Sustainable quality. The bank account has been ignored long enough. It's time to look at the balance. You're still here. 2 chapters in, that's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. Chapter 3. What actually makes people magnetic? People can smell need, not literally, but almost. There's a specific energy that comes off someone who is trying too hard, who is performing rather than existing, auditioning rather than arriving. You've felt it. Someone walks into a room and immediately starts working the room, laughing slightly too loudly, agreeing slightly too quickly, leaning in a fraction too far. Nothing is technically wrong. Everything is slightly off. You can't explain why you don't fully trust them. You just don't. Now think about the opposite. Someone you've met, maybe once, maybe years ago, who just seemed settled, not arrogant, not performing confidence, just present. They had opinions they didn't apologize for. They listened without obviously waiting for their turn to speak. They weren't trying to win the room. The room just gradually oriented toward them anyway. That's the thing nobody tells you about magnetism. It has nothing to do with trying to be magnetic. In fact, trying to be magnetic is precisely what prevents it. Here's the psychology. Humans are wired to detect inauthenticity the way they detect spoiled food, not through conscious analysis, but through a felt sense that something is off. When someone is performing, when their behavior is calibrated for effect rather than expression, something registers as wrong even before you can name it. The opposite is also true. When someone is genuinely themselves, not performing, not managing your impression of them, there's a quality of relief in it. Like finally finding a chair that's actually comfortable after a long time pretending others were fine. That relief is what people call charisma. It's mostly just authenticity in a world of performance. I watched a colleague spend 3 years trying to become the kind of person people wanted to follow. He read the books, adjusted his body language, worked on his executive presence. He got better at the performance. People still didn't trust him. He couldn't figure out why. The answer was simple and brutal. He was still doing it for them. Everything was calibrated outward. There was no internal conviction driving any of it, just a sophisticated imitation of one. The magnetic effect, real magnetism, the kind that lasts, is a byproduct. It arrives when you stop trying to produce it and start doing something else entirely. Becoming genuinely skilled at something, genuinely clear about something, genuinely comfortable in your own skin. Not because those things make you attractive, because they make you real. And real, in a world full of performance, is extraordinarily rare. This is why self-development done correctly changes how people respond to you. Not because you've learned new social techniques, but because you've actually changed. The confidence isn't borrowed anymore. The opinions aren't constructed for approval. The clarity isn't rehearsed. It's the difference between someone who has actually been somewhere and someone who has memorized descriptions of the place. People know. They always know. There are specific qualities that create this effect, and none of them are what the social skills industry wants to sell you. The first is genuine competence. Not the appearance of competence, actual earned skill in areas that matter to you. Competence creates a quality of ease that cannot be faked over time. When someone truly knows what they're doing, there's a different quality to how they move through a domain. Less hedging, less performance of expertise. Just the quiet confidence of someone who has been wrong enough times in private to be right more often in public. The second is emotional steadiness. Not coldness, steadiness. The ability to remain functional when things get uncomfortable. This is magnetic because most people are not steady. Most people are one difficult conversation, one piece of bad news, one social rejection away from becoming visibly destabilized. Someone who doesn't do that, who can hear something hard and stay present with it, is quietly remarkable. You want to be around them because they make difficulty feel survivable. The third is directness. Saying what you actually think, clearly, without burying it in qualifications and social softeners. This is rarer than it sounds. Most people have been so thoroughly trained to manage other people's reactions that they've lost access to their actual positions. They give you the diplomatic version, the version that's been processed for palatability, and somewhere underneath it is the real thought, which you will never hear. The person who just tells you what they think, respectfully but without performance, is someone you will keep coming back to. Not because you always agree, because you always know where you stand. The fourth is self-containment. This is the hardest one to explain and the easiest to recognize. It's the quality of someone who doesn't require the room to validate them, who isn't scanning for approval, who seems genuinely indifferent to whether you're impressed because they have their own internal accounting system and it doesn't run on your opinion. This isn't arrogance. Arrogance is fragile. It's insecurity in an expensive coat. Self-containment is just someone who has done enough internal work that external validation stopped being the primary currency. When you combine these four qualities, something shifts in how people relate to you. They stop trying to manage you. They stop performing for you. They become almost involuntarily more honest, because your honesty created permission. The dynamic changes from social transaction to something that actually resembles connection. Here's the part that's easy to misunderstand. None of this is a strategy. The moment you treat these qualities as techniques for attracting people, you've already lost the thread. You're back in performance mode. The whole mechanism depends on the thing being real, which means the only path to genuine magnetism is genuine development. Actual skill, actually built. Actual emotional work, actually done. Actual clarity about who you are and what you value, arrived at through genuine reflection rather than constructed for an audience. It takes longer than learning a technique. It doesn't work on a timeline you control. And it produces something that techniques never do. A quality of presence that people remember years later without being entirely sure why. That's not something you can manufacture, but it is something you can build. Chapter 4. The Obsessive Ones. Most people want to be good at things. A small number of people cannot stop thinking about getting better. Those two groups live in completely different worlds. The difference isn't visible at first. Both groups show up. Both groups put in time. Both groups can tell you, if asked, that they care about improvement. But watch them long enough, and the gap becomes unmistakable. One group practices until they reach acceptable. The other group reaches acceptable and gets mildly irritated. because now they can see the next level clearly, and the distance is annoying, and they'd like to close it. The first group experiences mastery as a destination. The second experiences it as a condition, something they live inside, not something they're traveling toward. This distinction changes everything about how a life unfolds. There's a word people use for this quality, obsessive, and they usually mean it as a warning. Don't become obsessed. Find balance. Remember what matters. This advice is well-intentioned and almost always delivered by someone who has never experienced what it feels like to be genuinely consumed by the pursuit of excellence in something they actually care about. They're warning you about a fire they've never stood near. The heat they're describing isn't dangerous. It's the point. The obsessive ones are not suffering. That's the misunderstanding. They look from the outside like people who need to relax. From the inside, they're doing the only thing that has ever made them feel fully awake. I spent years trying to want things moderately, trying to be interested without being consumed, engaged without being driven, ambitious without being uncomfortable to be around at dinner. It didn't work. The moderate version of me accomplished moderate things and felt, underneath the reasonableness, like someone living in a house that was slightly too small. The ceilings were low. I kept adjusting my posture. What the mastery mindset actually is, stripped of the motivational language, is a different relationship with discomfort. Average performers experience difficulty as a signal to slow down. People with a mastery orientation experience it as a signal that something interesting is happening. Not because they enjoy pain, because they've learned through enough repetition that difficulty is where the actual development lives. Everything before difficulty is just rehearsal. This reframe is not cosmetic. It produces structurally different behavior over time. The person who experiences challenge as threat will, over years, gradually narrow their world down to the things they're already good at. Safer that way. Less exposure. The person who experiences challenge as information will, over the same period, gradually expand their world, because every difficult thing they pushed through revealed a larger space on the other side. 30 years of those two trajectories produces people who are almost unrecognizable to each other. The mastery mindset also changes your relationship with failure in a way that's genuinely hard to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. Failure stops being evidence. It stops being the thing that tells you who you are. It becomes instead data, specific, actionable, occasionally humbling data about what your current approach is missing. This doesn't mean failure stops feeling bad. It still feels bad. The mastery-oriented person is not immune to disappointment. They just don't stay in it long, because disappointment is a weather event, and they're trying to build something, and you cannot build things while staring at the weather. They fail faster than most people. This sounds like a problem. It isn't. Failing faster means learning faster, which means the gap between current ability and target ability closes faster. The people who are terrified of failure fail slowly, invisibly, by never attempting anything that could reveal a gap. They protect their self-image so carefully that they never actually find out what they're capable of. This is its own kind of failure. A quieter one. Here's what intrinsic motivation, the fuel that powers mastery, actually feels like from the inside. It doesn't feel like discipline. It doesn't feel like pushing through resistance. It feels like a problem you can't stop turning over. Like an itch that requires a specific kind of scratching. Like the mild dissatisfaction of knowing you did something at 70% capacity when you're capable of 90. And that gap won't leave you alone until you close it. External rewards. Recognition, money, approval are fine. They're not nothing. But they're structurally incapable of producing this quality of motivation because they operate from the outside in. They require something to happen to you. Intrinsic motivation operates from the inside out. It doesn't wait for conditions to be right or for someone to notice. It just runs. Quietly, consistently, regardless of audience. This is why intrinsically motivated people are so difficult to derail. You can take away the recognition. You can create obstacles. You can put them in environments that don't reward what they're building. They keep building anyway. Not out of stubbornness, out of genuine inability to imagine doing otherwise. The mastery mindset also produces a specific and unusual relationship with other people's success. The average performer experiences someone else's excellence as a threat, evidence of a competition they might be losing. The mastery-oriented person experiences it as a benchmark, as proof of concept, as information about what the ceiling actually is, which turns out to be higher than they thought, which is genuinely exciting rather than threatening. This is not a personality trait. It's a consequence of where your attention lives. When you're focused on your own development, other people's success simply isn't in competition with it. There's no zero-sum game happening. They did something remarkable. Now you know it's possible. That's useful information. You'll take it. The compound effect of this orientation, pursued consistently over years, produces people who seem, from the outside, like they got lucky, like something broke their way, like the circumstances aligned. What actually happened is simpler and less romantic. They just refused to stop getting better. Long after it was socially expected, long after most people had found their comfortable level and settled into it, long after the results seemed disproportionate to the effort. The results are always disproportionate eventually. That's how compounding works. What the obsessive ones understand, and what takes everyone else too long to figure out, is this. The ceiling you're currently living under is not the actual ceiling. It's just the highest point you've been willing to reach so far. The room is bigger than you've been using. Chapter 5. The Art of Building Walls. People actually respect. Every boundary you've ever failed to set has taught someone exactly how to treat you. Not intentionally. People aren't usually sitting around strategizing about how to exploit your accommodating nature. They're just responding to information you've given them. You said yes when you meant no. You stayed when you wanted to leave. You absorbed behavior you found unacceptable and then smiled afterward. And they noted all of it, not consciously, but in the way people always note what they can get away with, and adjusted accordingly. This is not their fault. You wrote the manual. They're just following it. The conversation about boundaries has been so thoroughly co-opted by therapy speak that most people either roll their eyes at the word or use it as a vague gesture towards something they can't quite define. I need to set better boundaries has become the personal development equivalent of I should really drink more water, technically true, perpetually deferred, and somehow never specific enough to actually change anything. So let's be specific. A boundary is not a wall. It's not a declaration of what other people are allowed to do. You don't control other people. A boundary is a decision about what you will do, how you will respond, what you will and won't participate in, where you will and won't invest your time and attention. It operates entirely on your side of the line. Other people can do whatever they want. You just get to decide what happens next. This distinction matters enormously. Most people frame boundaries as attempts to control others, which is why they feel guilty about them and why others resist them. But a boundary correctly understood is just self-governance. You're not telling someone what they can do. You're telling them what you'll do. There's a significant difference, and clarity about that difference removes most of the guilt. A close friend used to call me 3, sometimes 4 times a week, to process the same relationship problems. Same dynamics, same conversation, slight variations in the details. I listened every time. I offered perspective every time. Nothing changed. The calls kept coming. Eventually, I realized I wasn't helping. I was providing a release valve that made it easier to avoid actually addressing anything. I stopped being available for the 4th call of the week. She was annoyed for about 2 weeks. Then she started making different decisions. The boundary helped her more than the listening did. I just couldn't see that until I stopped performing helpfulness long enough to notice what it was actually producing. Here's what happens in the absence of clear boundaries. Your life becomes organized around everyone else's priorities, not because anyone forced this on you, because you never indicated you had any of your own. Nature abhors a vacuum. People will fill the space you don't claim, not out of malice, just out of the basic human tendency to expand into available territory. The solution is not to become unavailable or difficult. The solution is to be clear. Clear is kind, even when it's uncomfortable. What's actually unkind is the performance of availability, showing up, saying yes, giving the impression that everything is fine, while internally tracking resentment that you'll eventually, inevitably, express sideways. That sideways expression is where relationships actually break. Not in the moment of the honest conversation you avoided, in the accumulated weight of all the things you didn't say, delivered in tone, in withdrawal, in 1,000 small signals that something has gone wrong, and nobody can quite identify what. Boundaries prevent that. They keep the accounting current. The people who are genuinely good at this share a quality that looks, superficially, like confidence, but is actually something more specific. They are comfortable with other people's temporary disappointment. They've made peace with the fact that saying no produces a moment of friction, and that moment of friction is preferable to a long, slow erosion of resentment. They've done the math. The short discomfort is the better deal. Most people haven't done that math. They're still optimizing for immediate social comfort, for the absence of friction right now, without accounting for what the friction avoidance costs over time. They pay in installments so small they can ignore each one individually. The total, at the end, is not small. Personal standards are the foundation of this. Not rules you impose on others. Standards you hold for yourself about what conditions need to be present for you to invest your time and energy in something. You might have a standard that you don't engage in conversations that are fundamentally circular and resistant to resolution. You might have a standard that relationships require reciprocity to maintain your full investment. You might have a standard that your work time is protected from interruptions that could wait. None of these standards require anyone else's cooperation. They just require you to follow through on them, which is the part most people skip. Setting a boundary and not enforcing it is worse than not setting it at all. It teaches people that your stated limits are negotiable, that enough pressure will move them, that your words and your actions don't reliably match. This erodes your credibility, not just with them, but with yourself. Every time you say something and then do the opposite, you make a small withdrawal from the account of self-trust. Enough withdrawals, and you stop believing your own commitments, which makes every future attempt to set a boundary feel hollow from the start. Enforcement is where most people collapse, because enforcement almost always involves a moment of conflict. Not necessarily dramatic conflict, but the quiet friction of doing what you said you'd do when someone was counting on you not to. That friction is the cost of admission. There's no way around it. You pay it, or you don't have the boundary. What the friction produces, when you pay it consistently, is something unexpected. Respect. Not immediately. Not always visibly. But over time, people adjust to your limits the way they adjust to any consistent feature of the environment. They stop testing what they've learned is firm. They begin to trust that your yes means yes, because they've seen that your no means no. Your yes becomes worth something, and the relationships that survive your clarity, the ones that don't evaporate the moment you stop being infinitely accommodating, are the ones telling you something important. They're showing you who was actually there for you versus who was there for the version of you that never pushed back. That information is useful. It's also occasionally painful. It's still worth having. The walls you build correctly don't keep people out. They show people where the door is. Chapter 6. Who are you, actually? If I asked you what you actually want, not what you're supposed to want, not what sounds reasonable, could you answer without a 3-second pause? Most people can't. And the pause isn't shyness. It's a genuine search through files that haven't been opened in years, some of which turn out to be empty. This is the part of self-development that doesn't get enough attention. Everyone talks about goals, habits, discipline, execution. All of that assumes you already know what you're building toward, that the destination is clear and the only problem is logistics. But for most people, the destination isn't clear. It's borrowed. It's assembled from what parents approved of, what peers seemed to value, what culture designated as success, and what felt safe enough to want, without risking too much embarrassment if it didn't work out. You didn't choose most of it. It accumulated. And now you're living inside a life that fits the way someone else's clothes fit. Not terribly, not perfectly. Just slightly wrong in ways that are hard to describe and impossible to ignore. Vision clarity is not goal setting. Goals are tactical. They exist at the level of what you do. Vision is about who you are. Which values actually govern your behavior when the stakes are real? Which contributions would make you feel genuinely proud? Which version of yourself you'd recognize as fully expressed rather than perpetually edited? That's a different kind of question. It requires a different kind of honesty. The honesty it requires is specifically about the gap between what you say you value and what you actually demonstrate you value with your time and attention. These two things are, for most people, significantly different, and the gap between them is where a quiet, persistent dissatisfaction lives. Here's a useful exercise that most people find uncomfortable. Look at last week. Not your intentions for last week. What actually happened? Where did your time go? What did you choose when you had a choice? What did you protect, and what did you sacrifice? Your actual values are not the ones on your mental list of admirable qualities. Your actual values are the ones visible in that data. For a lot of people, that examination reveals something they didn't want to see. That they value approval more than they value honesty. That they value comfort more than they value growth. That they value being liked more than being known. Not because they're weak or shallow, but because those values were installed early, reinforced constantly, and never consciously examined. You can't build a life around authentic values you haven't identified. You'll keep building around inherited ones, and wondering why what you're building doesn't feel like yours. I had a version of this reckoning in my early 30s. I'd been pursuing a particular kind of professional success, the kind that looked impressive from the outside and generated the right responses at family gatherings. And one afternoon, for no dramatic reason, I sat with the question of whether I actually wanted it. Not whether it was good, whether I wanted it. The answer that came back was quiet and uncomfortable. Not really. I wanted the approval it represented. The thing itself left me largely indifferent. That was an expensive thing to discover late. It would have been more expensive to never discover it. The process of developing genuine vision clarity involves 3 layers, each one requiring more honesty than the last. The first layer is values archaeology, digging beneath the stated values to find the operational ones, the ones actually running the show. This means examining your emotional reactions, not just your intellectual positions. What genuinely excites you, unprompted, when no one is watching? What makes you lose track of time in a way that doesn't feel like avoidance? What, when you're doing it, produces a quality of engagement that's qualitatively different from obligation? Those reactions are information. They're your actual wiring, trying to show you something your rational mind has been overriding. The second layer is future self-clarity. Not in the vision board sense, in the identity sense. Who do you want to have become 10 years from now? Not what do you want to have achieved. Who do you want to be? What do you want to think like? How do you want to respond to difficulty? What do you want to stand for consistently when it's inconvenient? This version of you is the target. Every current decision is either moving toward them or away from them. Most people have never made this person vivid. They have vague, pleasant impressions of a future self who is somehow more successful and less stressed, but no real specificity about what that person actually looks like from the inside. Without specificity, the image can't guide anything. It's just a pleasant blur in the distance. The third layer is the hardest. It requires separating what feels meaningful to you from what you've been taught should feel meaningful. These are not the same thing. Not even close. Culture is very good at providing prepackaged meanings. Success looks like this. A good life includes this. Achievement in this domain is worth more than achievement in that domain. Most people absorb this hierarchy without questioning it, and then spend years climbing a ladder that turns out to be leaning against the wrong wall. The wall is very impressive. The view from the top is not what they thought. The question, what would actually feel meaningful to me if I removed the question of whether it impresses anyone, is one most people have never seriously asked. The answer, when you find it, often feels simultaneously obvious and slightly embarrassing, because it's usually simpler than the borrowed ambitions you replaced it with. More specific, less legible to the people you've been trying to impress. That simplicity is not a sign that you're thinking too small. It's a sign you finally found the actual signal underneath all the noise. When you combine these 3 layers, operational values, vivid future self, genuine meaning, you start to have something that can actually function as a compass, not a perfect map. Compasses don't give you the map. They just tell you which direction is north, so that when choices arise, you have an orientation that's yours rather than borrowed. Decisions get easier, boundaries become obvious, energy finds a direction that feels like moving rather than just motion. The life you're building starts to feel, for the first time in a while, like something you chose. Chapter 7. The people who are quietly holding you back. There's someone in your life right now who gets slightly uncomfortable when things go well for you. You've noticed. You've explained it away. Maybe you told yourself they were just having a hard time. Maybe you decided it wasn't about you. Maybe you performed the generosity of misreading it entirely, because the accurate reading was more complicated than you were ready to deal with. Whatever the explanation, the discomfort was real, and you saw it, and you filed it somewhere you don't look very often. That file is worth opening. This chapter is not about becoming suspicious of everyone around you. It's not about auditing your relationships for hidden enemies. It's about something quieter and more important. understanding that your environment is not neutral. The people you spend the most time with are not merely witnesses to your development. They are active participants in it, shaping what feels normal, what feels possible, what feels like too much. Most of this happens without anyone trying. That's what makes it so effective. Here's the mechanism. Humans calibrate to their reference group, not consciously, viscerally. When everyone around you treats a certain level of ambition as normal, that level becomes your floor. When everyone around you treats it as excessive, something in you starts to feel excessive too. The adjustment isn't dramatic. It's gradual, invisible, and cumulative. By the time you notice it, years of calibration have already happened. This is why environment is not a secondary factor in personal development. It's not the backdrop. It's part of the actual system. The people who quietly hold you back are not villains. This is crucial to understand, because if you make them villains, you miss the actual dynamic, and you stay in it longer than you should. They're just people who have found a certain equilibrium, and your movement towards something different disturbs that equilibrium in ways they're not fully conscious of. When you start setting boundaries, you're implicitly questioning the arrangement where you had none. When you start pursuing goals seriously, you're implicitly questioning the shared agreement not to pursue things too seriously. When you start improving, you're holding up a mirror that reflects, however unintentionally, wherever they've stopped. People do not enjoy mirrors that reflect that. So the resistance comes, dressed usually as concern. Are you sure you're not overdoing it? Translation. This pace makes me uncomfortable. You've really changed. Translation. You're not behaving according to the version of you I was relying on. I just worry you're becoming obsessed. Translation. Your commitment is revealing my lack of it, and I'd like you to slow down. None of this is necessarily conscious. That's not an excuse. The impact is the same whether it's intentional or not. Every hour you spend absorbing that energy, defending your choices to people who aren't genuinely interested in understanding them, or moderating your behavior to keep the peace in environments that punish growth. That's an hour you're not spending on the thing you said mattered to you. The chronically negative are easy to identify. Easier anyway. What's harder are the people who love you and still hold you back. The family member who criticizes your goals not out of malice but out of genuine fear that you'll fail, or succeed, or change in ways that mean you need them less. The old friend whose entire model of your relationship was built on a version of you that no longer exists, and who experiences your evolution as a kind of abandonment. These are real losses, and they deserve real acknowledgement. But they are not reasons to stop. The honest assessment requires you to ask, after spending time with specific people, a simple set of questions. Do I feel clearer or more confused about what I'm trying to build? Do I feel more capable or less? Do I leave the interaction with energy or without it? Do I feel more like myself or more like an older, smaller version of myself that I've been working to outgrow? These questions are not asking whether the person is good or bad. They're asking what the interaction produces. That's a different question, and it has a more useful answer. What you do with that answer is a matter of judgment, not formula. Some relationships can be renegotiated. You can change how you engage without eliminating the relationship, shifting certain conversations, reducing certain kinds of access, refusing to participate in dynamics that don't serve either of you. This works when there's genuine goodwill underneath the problematic patterns. When the person, at their core, wants good things for you even if their current behavior doesn't reflect it. Some relationships cannot be renegotiated. Some dynamics are structural. They only function if you stay small, stay available, stay the version of yourself that predates your current trajectory. When you stop cooperating with the structure, the relationship doesn't evolve. It ends, or it atrophies into something distant and occasional. This is painful. It should be. Anyone who tells you that outgrowing certain relationships is easy is either lying or hasn't actually done it. There's grief in it. Real grief, for real people, for real histories that mattered. The grief doesn't mean you made the wrong decision. What comes after the grief, and this takes time, more time than you want it to, is space. Room that was previously occupied by management, by the low-grade maintenance of relationships that required constant accommodation to sustain. That room gets filled, gradually, by something better. People who are also moving, who find your ambition recognizable rather than threatening, who celebrate your wins without the slight flinch you'd learn to look past. These relationships feel structurally different from the ones they replaced. Less drama, more honesty, less performance, more ease. You can be fully yourself and find that it's enough, more than enough, actually, without editing or moderating or making yourself smaller to fit the available space. Because the available space is now larger. You cleared it. The people who belong in your life at the level you're building toward are not people who need you to stay where you are. They're people who are going somewhere themselves, who find your momentum interesting rather than inconvenient, who, when things go well for you, feel something uncomplicated and genuine. You know the feeling when it happens. There's no slight hesitation in it. No flicker of something underneath the congratulations. Just the clean, simple pleasure of someone you care about getting what they deserve. That's what you're making room for. Chapter 8. Confidence is not what you think it is. Confidence isn't a feeling. Feelings come and go. Confidence is a credit score, built slowly, destroyed quickly, and entirely based on whether you kept your word to yourself. Most people have been chasing the feeling. The feeling of walking into a room and not being afraid. The feeling of speaking without second-guessing every word. The feeling of knowing, somewhere underneath the noise, that you are capable and worthy and sufficient. They've been waiting for that feeling to arrive naturally, or trying to generate it artificially, through achievements, through approval, through the accumulation of external evidence that they are, in fact, okay. It doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is structural, not motivational. The feeling of confidence that most people are chasing is actually ego validation. It's the sensation of being confirmed by the outside world, praised, recognized, compared favorably to others. And ego validation, while pleasant, has a fundamental design flaw. It depends entirely on factors you don't control. Someone else's opinion, someone else's mood, someone else's willingness to tell you what you need to hear. Build your confidence on that, and you've built it on rented ground. The landlord can change the terms at any time. Real confidence has a completely different foundation. It's built on evidence. Specifically, on evidence you've generated yourself through your own behavior about your own reliability. Not evidence that you're talented. Not evidence that other people approve of you. Evidence that when you make a commitment to yourself, you follow through on it. That's it. That's the whole mechanism. Every time you say you're going to do something and you do it. Wake up at 6. Finish the difficult conversation. Push through the uncomfortable workout. Write the thing you've been avoiding. You make a deposit into the account. Every time you make a commitment and break it, you make a withdrawal. The balance of that account, accumulated over months and years of daily transactions, is your actual confidence level. Not the performed version, the real one. The reason most people's confidence is fragile is not that they're weak or deficient. It's that they've been making more withdrawals than deposits for a long time. They set ambitious intentions and abandon them when motivation drops. They commit to changes that last 3 weeks. They promise themselves things: rest, growth, honesty, better choices, and then quietly unpromise them when circumstances get inconvenient. Each broken commitment is a small signal sent to yourself: I can't fully trust me. Enough of those signals, and you stop trusting yourself at a fundamental level. Which is why external validation becomes so necessary. You're trying to borrow confidence from others because the internal account is overdrawn. The rebuild doesn't start with big gestures. It starts embarrassingly small. You pick something modest, genuinely modest, not the scaled-down version of an ambitious goal, but something you're nearly certain you can maintain even on your worst days. 15 minutes of reading, a 10-minute walk, writing 3 sentences. The specificity matters less than the consistency. You're not trying to transform your life in week 1. You're trying to prove to yourself that your word to yourself means something. This feels almost insultingly simple. That's the correct response. The simplicity is the point. Because the mechanism isn't about the activity, it's about the pattern. Every day you follow through, you deposit a unit of evidence. I said I would, and I did. Do that enough times and something quietly shifts. Not dramatically. There's no moment where confidence suddenly arrives. It accumulates the way interest accumulates. Invisibly, then noticeably, then substantially. Then you increase the difficulty. Slightly. Not dramatically. You're not trying to overwhelm the system. You're trying to compound it. There's a second component that most confidence conversations skip entirely. It's the ability to process failure without letting it rewrite your identity. Confident people fail constantly. More than average, actually. Because they attempt more, and attempting more means failing more. The difference is in what the failure means to them. To someone with fragile confidence, failure is confirmation of a feared truth, that they're not capable, not worthy, not enough. The failure doesn't just represent itself, it represents everything. To someone with genuine confidence, failure is information. Specific, actionable, temporarily uncomfortable information about what their current approach is missing. It doesn't land on identity. It lands on strategy. They adjust the strategy. They continue. This distinction, failure as identity versus failure as data, is one of the most consequential differences between people who keep going and people who stop. And it's not a personality trait you either have or don't. It's a practiced response. You can practice it. The practice looks like this. When something goes wrong, a rejection, a setback, a result that didn't match the effort, you ask 2 questions before you ask anything else. First, what specifically happened here? Not the narrative version, not the emotionally processed version, the factual version. Second, what adjustment does this suggest? Not what does this say about me? What adjustment does this suggest? Those 2 questions are a redirect. They move the processing from identity to information. Done consistently, they rewire how failure lands. Internal validation is the third piece, and arguably the most underrated. Most people have outsourced their quality assessment entirely. They don't know if something they did was good unless someone tells them. They don't know if they're making progress unless the progress produces visible external results. They've handed the measurement apparatus to the world and forgotten they ever had one of their own. Developing internal validation means rebuilding that apparatus. It means learning to assess your own performance against your own standards, not against other people's results, not against external praise, but against the gap between where you are and where you were. Am I better than I was last month? Did I handle that better than I would have handled it a year ago? Did I stay true to what I said mattered to me? Those questions generate a kind of satisfaction that external recognition can't produce and can't take away. They make you legible to yourself, which is, it turns out, the prerequisite for being genuinely confident in the world. The person who doesn't need the room to confirm them is not performing indifference. They've just done enough internal accounting that the external vote stopped being the primary data source. That shift from external to internal is what confidence actually is. Everything else is just waiting for a feeling that was never going to arrive the way you were looking for it. Chapter 9: The Math Nobody Wants to Do. You already know what you should be doing. You've known for a while. The question isn't information, it's math. Specifically, it's the math of small numbers compounding over long periods, which human brains are spectacularly bad at intuitively grasping, and which turns out to be the entire game. Here's the problem. You can read 10 pages of a genuinely valuable book today and feel, at the end of it, essentially the same as you did at the beginning. No visible transformation, no dramatic shift in capability. Just 10 pages and a mild sense that you did something marginally productive. If you're optimizing for the feeling of progress, 10 pages feels like nothing. So you don't bother, or you bother inconsistently, or you bother for 3 weeks and then stop because the results aren't matching the effort. What you can't feel in that moment is what 10 pages a day becomes across 400 days. Roughly 15 books. 15 books on subjects that compound on each other, that change how you think, that install frameworks you'll use for the rest of your life. You can't feel that from inside a single Tuesday evening. The math doesn't reveal itself at that resolution. This is not a motivational problem. It's a perception problem. Your brain evaluates effort and return in the short window, where small, consistent actions look like they're producing nothing. The actual return lives in the long window, where those same actions have been compounding for long enough to become visible. The gap between those two windows is where most people's potential disappears. They stop before the math has time to work. The compound effect has been discussed enough that most people nod along when they hear about it. They agree, intellectually, that small, consistent actions compound into large results. Then they go home and do something else. The knowing and the doing are separated by something that isn't lack of information. It's the felt experience of early-stage compounding, which is indistinguishable from nothing happening. Nothing is happening. That's the point. The returns are microscopic and invisible at the start. They don't become visible until you've been in the game long enough that the base has grown to a size where the next increment of growth is actually noticeable. Before that threshold, you are operating on faith in math, which requires trusting a calculation rather than a feeling. Most people trust feelings. The honest version of this is worth sitting with. You have been, at some level, expecting change to feel like change while it's happening. You've been waiting for some perceptible signal, some shift in energy, some visible improvement, some clear evidence that the thing you're doing is working, before you'll commit to doing it consistently. That expectation is the exact thing preventing the compounding from starting, because the compounding starts before you can see it. That's what compounding means. I started writing for 20 minutes every morning for reasons I couldn't fully articulate. Not because I had a clear goal, not because anyone was going to read it, just because something in me needed the practice. For months, nothing happened that I could point to. The writing wasn't better in any way I could measure. Then one day, someone asked me to explain something complex, and I did it. clearly and quickly, in a way I hadn't been able to before. The 20 minutes had been building something. I just couldn't see it while it was being built. The identity dimension of this is where the real transformation lives, and it's underappreciated. Behavioral change, trying to do different things while remaining the same person, is exhausting and unstable. It requires constant willpower because it runs against your current self-concept. But identity change, actually becoming someone different, makes the behaviors feel natural rather than forced. The behaviors become expressions of who you are rather than obligations you're managing. The compound effect produces identity change as a byproduct, not immediately, gradually, through the accumulation of evidence. Every day you read, you add a small increment of evidence to the proposition. I am someone who values learning. Every day you exercise, you reinforce. I am someone who takes care of their body. Every day you work on the skill, the project, the goal. You deposit into an identity account that is slowly and then suddenly rewriting how you see yourself. And how you see yourself determines what feels natural. And what feels natural determines what you do without deciding to. This is the tipping point most people never reach, because they stop before getting there. At a certain threshold of accumulated identity evidence, behavior that used to require effort becomes automatic. The person who struggled to read consistently becomes someone who feels wrong when they haven't read. The person who resisted exercise becomes someone who feels off without it. The change has gone deep enough that it's no longer maintained by willpower. It's maintained by identity. Willpower is a terrible long-term strategy. It depletes. It's unreliable. It depends on conditions staying favorable. Identity is a much better strategy. It runs in the background. It doesn't require a decision each time. The practical implication of all this is that the question is never what massive change can I make? It's what small action can I take consistently enough that it compounds into something I can't currently imagine. The answer is usually smaller than you want it to be. Embarrassingly small, again. Because your instinct is to calibrate the effort to the size of the goal, which means setting a pace you can't sustain, burning out in 6 weeks, and concluding that you're not disciplined enough. You are disciplined enough. You just chose a pace designed for sprinting, and then were surprised when you couldn't run a marathon at it. The sustainable pace feels almost irresponsibly slow at the start. That's correct. Irresponsibly slow, maintained without interruption, beats ambitious and inconsistent every time across every time horizon worth measuring. The other calculation most people avoid is the cost of not compounding. Not the absence of gain, the active cost. Every day you don't work on the thing that matters, you're not at neutral. You're drifting. Skills atrophy without use. Habits weaken without reinforcement. The gap between where you are and where you want to be doesn't stay constant. It grows slowly in the direction of inertia. There is no pause button. The math runs in both directions. This is not meant to produce anxiety. It's meant to produce clarity about what the actual stakes of daily decisions are. Today's 20 minutes is not just 20 minutes. It's 20 minutes of compounding or 20 minutes of drift. The difference across a decade is not incremental. It is not an exaggeration to say that the person you are 10 years from now is being determined largely by what you do in the next 30 days, not by any single decision, by the pattern of small decisions repeated often enough that they become the operating system rather than the occasional override. You already know what the small decisions should be. You've known for a while. The math is patient. It will wait. The question is whether you'll start before it has to. Chapter 10. How to let criticism slide off. The person who told you your goals were unrealistic was telling you about their goals, not yours. This sounds like a bumper sticker. It isn't. It's a precise description of how criticism actually works. And understanding the mechanism is the difference between being derailed by other people's discomfort and being genuinely unmoved by it. Here's the mechanism. When someone encounters your ambition and responds with skepticism, what they're doing, almost always, almost entirely, is running your stated goal through their own internal model of what's achievable. That model is built from their experience, their attempts, their failures, their particular set of fears about what happens when you try too hard and fall short. Their assessment of your chances is not an objective analysis. It's a projection. They're telling you what they would do, what they think they could achieve, what feels reasonable inside their current psychology. None of that has anything to do with you. This doesn't make them bad people. It makes them human. Humans evaluate the unfamiliar by reference to the familiar. They don't have access to your internal resources, your specific capabilities, your particular reasons for pursuing something. They only have access to the external description of the goal, plus whatever their own experience suggests about that category of ambition. Their criticism is, in a technical sense, autobiographical. It's a report on them dressed as a report on you. Once you understand this, the experience of being criticized changes structurally. It stops feeling like an attack that requires defense and starts feeling like information about the critic. Still uncomfortable sometimes, but no longer destabilizing in the way it was before. The criticism that actually matters, the small fraction that does, looks completely different from the rest. It comes from people who understand what you're trying to do, who have relevant experience in the domain, who want you to succeed and are pointing to something specific that would help you do that better. It's actionable. It's offered without hostility. And it's usually delivered quietly, without drama, because it doesn't need drama to land. Everything else is noise. And noise, it turns out, has a very consistent signature once you know what to listen for. The signature of noise. It's vague. It doesn't point to anything specific you could adjust. It addresses the goal itself rather than the execution. It carries an emotional charge that seems slightly disproportionate to the stakes, and it arrives most reliably at the moments when you're making the most visible progress, because that's when your trajectory is most threatening to someone who has decided not to have one. The armor against noise is not toughness. Trying to become impervious to criticism through sheer psychological hardening doesn't work. It makes you defensive, which is its own kind of fragility. Real armor is more specific than that. It's built from three things that work together. The first is internal clarity. When you know exactly why you're pursuing something, not the impressive explanation you give at dinner, but the real reason, the one that lives underneath the social framing. External criticism loses most of its leverage. It can't find a foothold. You already know why you're doing this. You've already had the harder conversation with yourself. What a skeptic offers you is a much easier version of the questions you've already answered. This is why the vision work in the previous chapters is not separate from resilience. It's the foundation of it. Clarity is armor. Not because it makes you certain you'll succeed, but because it makes you certain about why you're trying, which is the only certainty you actually need. The second is the ability to distinguish between the message and the delivery. Sometimes criticism carries a valid point inside an invalid package. The person is hostile or clumsy or clearly motivated by something other than your well-being, and the content of what they're saying still happens to be true. If you dismiss everything based on delivery, you miss that. If you accept everything based on delivery, you're vulnerable to anyone who knows how to be charming. The skill is surgical. You extract the information and evaluate it independently of the emotional packaging. Does this point to something specific and real? Is it actionable? Does it come from someone with relevant knowledge? If yes, you keep it and discard the packaging. If no, you discard both. This requires a certain emotional stillness, the ability to hear something without immediately needing to have a feeling about the person who said it. That stillness is developed the same way everything else in this book is developed. Incrementally, through practice, by doing it imperfectly until you do it better. The third component is what actually makes the other two possible. Results. Not grand, public, undeniable results. Just the private accumulation of evidence that your approach is working, that you're improving, that the thing you're building is becoming more real, even slowly. When you have that evidence, criticism stops feeling like a verdict and starts feeling like an opinion. Opinions are fine. People are allowed to have them. They're just not required to govern your decisions. There's a particular kind of social pressure that deserves its own attention because it operates differently from direct criticism. It's the ambient pressure of a group that has collectively decided not to push too hard, want too much, or take themselves too seriously as aspiring people. Nobody says it explicitly. It's enforced through tone. The slight eye roll, the gentle mockery of ambition, the subtle way the conversation moves away from serious discussion of goals and towards safer, more ironic territory. This pressure is harder to identify and harder to resist than direct criticism because it has no specific claim to refute. There's nothing to argue with. There's just an atmosphere that makes your seriousness feel slightly embarrassing. Your ambition feels slightly excessive. Your commitment feels slightly weird. The only real defense against it is spending less time in it. Not through confrontation, through simple reduction of exposure. The atmosphere loses power when you're not in it. When you surround yourself with people who find ambition normal, who discuss goals without irony, who take improvement seriously without performing self-consciousness about it. The old atmosphere starts to seem foreign, like weather in a place you used to live. You can go back and visit. You just can't let it set your thermostat anymore. Here's what nobody tells you about becoming genuinely immune to criticism. It's not that the criticism stops coming. It often increases as you become more visible, more committed, more different from where you started. What changes is not the volume, it's the relationship. You stop bracing for it. You stop scanning for it in every interaction. You stop doing the preemptive self-criticism that most people use as a shield, tearing themselves down first so no one else gets the chance. That preemptive self-criticism is exhausting, and it doesn't work anyway. It just means you've outsourced the critic to yourself, where it has access to you 24 hours a day. When you put the shield down, something unexpected happens. The criticism that used to wound you starts arriving with less force. Not because you're tougher, because you're fuller. Because the internal account has enough in it that a withdrawal from outside no longer threatens the balance. That's the real immunity, not hardness, fullness. Build the inside strong enough, and the outside stops being able to reach it. Chapter 11. The Execution Gap. You are not lacking information. You are not lacking motivation. You are lacking a system that works when you don't feel like it. This is the sentence most people resist, because accepting it removes the last comfortable explanation for why things haven't happened yet. Information deficit is fixable. You just learn more. Motivation deficit is manageable. You just find better reasons. But a system problem is structural. It means the way you've been approaching execution is fundamentally flawed, not occasionally unlucky. It means the problem isn't that you haven't tried hard enough. It's that trying hard as a strategy, was never going to be sufficient. Trying hard is not a system, it's an event. Events are unreliable. They depend on conditions, your mood, your energy levels, the absence of competing demands, the presence of sufficient motivation to override inertia. When the conditions are favorable, trying hard produces results. When the conditions are unfavorable, which is most of the time, trying hard produces guilt about not trying hard enough. The gap between your intentions and your outputs gets explained as a character flaw. Lack of discipline, lack of willpower, lack of the particular internal quality that seems to come naturally to people who accomplish things. It's not a character flaw, it's a design flaw. And design flaws are fixable. The execution gap, the distance between what you intend to do and what you actually do, is not primarily a motivational problem. Motivation fluctuates. It's weather. Building your execution strategy on motivation is building your house on weather. Everything is fine until it isn't, and then everything falls apart simultaneously, and you have to start over from nothing. Systems are different. A system is a predetermined structure that produces behavior independently of how you feel about producing it. It removes the decision. It removes the negotiation with yourself about whether today is the right day, whether you have enough energy, whether you'll do it later when conditions are better. Conditions are never better. Later is a location that doesn't exist on any map you've ever used. The decision has already been made. The system executes it. What this looks like in practice is less sophisticated than the concept suggests. It's Tuesday at 6:30 in the morning and you write for 45 minutes. Not because you feel like writing, you don't, but because Tuesday at 6:30 is when writing happens. The time is the trigger. The environment is set up to make starting the path of least resistance. The decision was made when you designed the system, not each morning when you have to generate fresh motivation from scratch. This is why environment design is not a peripheral consideration. It's load-bearing. The environment determines what's easy and what's hard. What's easy happens. What's hard doesn't, regardless of how much you want it to. You cannot consistently rely on willpower to overcome a badly designed environment. Willpower is a finite resource that depletes through the day, starting from the moment you wake up. Every decision you make, every piece of resistance you overcome, draws from the same limited reserve. By evening, the reserve is gone, which is why your evenings look the way they do. Design the environment, so the right behavior requires less willpower, not more. Put the book on the pillow. Put the running shoes next to the door. Put the phone in another room during the hours when you're supposed to be doing the work that matters. Remove the friction from what you want to do. Add friction to what you want to avoid. Your behavior will follow the path of least resistance. The question is just whether you designed the path or inherited it. The second structural problem is priority confusion. Most people approach their days reactively, responding to whatever arrives first, whatever feels most urgent, whatever has the most social pressure behind it. This produces days that feel full, and weeks that feel busy, and quarters that somehow contain no progress on anything that genuinely mattered. Busyness and productivity are not the same thing. Busyness is motion. Productivity is motion in the right direction. The right direction requires knowing, specifically and in advance, what the 2 or 3 most important outcomes are that would move your actual goals forward. Not the list of 20 things that would be nice to accomplish. The 2 or 3 that, if everything else stayed the same, would make the quarter meaningfully different from the previous one. Those things get time first, before email, before requests, before the accumulated urgency of other people's priorities colonizing your morning. First, not because everything else doesn't matter, but because those things will never be urgent enough to fight their way to the front otherwise. Important things rarely arrive with the urgency that trivial things arrive with. They're patient. They'll wait. And while they wait, the urgent and the trivial consume everything. I built a habit years ago of asking one question before opening anything in the morning. What is the single most important thing I could do today? Not the most urgent, the most important. Then I did that first, before the day had a chance to become what other people needed it to be. Some days that took 20 minutes. Some days it took 3 hours. The days I skipped the question were the days I looked up at 4 in the afternoon and realized I'd been busy since 7 and done nothing I actually cared about. The third structural element is resistance management. Resistance is not a sign that you're doing the wrong thing. It's frequently a sign that you're doing exactly the right thing, something that matters enough to generate real friction. Your brain generates resistance toward anything that involves uncertainty, difficulty, or the possibility of failure, which is to say, toward anything worth doing. The amateur response to resistance is to wait for it to pass. The professional response is to start anyway, understanding that resistance diminishes within minutes of beginning and that the most dangerous moment is the moment before you start, not the work itself. This is almost universally true. The anticipation of a difficult task is reliably worse than the task. The dread of the difficult conversation is worse than the conversation. The anxiety about the intimidating project is worse than the hour spent actually working on it. Your brain generates vivid previews of discomfort that are dramatically exaggerated compared to the actual experience. You've confirmed this enough times to know it's true. The knowledge rarely makes the next instance easier. It still helps to have it. Breaking the task into its smallest possible starting unit also helps. Not the whole chapter, the first paragraph. Not the full workout, the shoes on, the door open. Not the entire difficult conversation, the first sentence. The starting unit needs to be small enough that you cannot credibly argue you don't have the capacity for it right now. Once you're started, inertia takes over. But you have to get started, and getting started is the only place where resistance has full power. The fourth element is momentum protection. Most people work in bursts, intense periods followed by complete stops, followed by the work of restarting from zero. This pattern is exhausting and inefficient because restarting from zero is the hardest part of any endeavor. The resistance is highest at the beginning. The momentum is lowest. You're doing the hardest work every time instead of building on what you've already built. Momentum, once established, has its own physics. Objects in motion stay in motion. The work gets easier when you've been doing it consistently, not because the work changes, but because you're not fighting inertia anymore. You're surfing it. The difference in felt difficulty between day 40 of a consistent practice and day 1 of a restart is not subtle. It's the difference between pushing a boulder uphill and rolling it downhill. Protect the streak. On the days when full effort isn't available, do something smaller rather than nothing. 5 minutes instead of 45. 1 paragraph instead of 1,000 words. The reduced output is not the point. The maintenance of continuity is the point. You're preserving the identity, the habit, the momentum, so that tomorrow doesn't require starting over. The execution gap closes not through heroic effort, but through the quiet, unsexy work of designing a life where the right things happen automatically, where the wrong things require more effort than they're worth, and where the decision has already been made before the moment arrives, when you'd otherwise negotiate yourself out of it. You don't need more motivation. You need a better machine. Build the machine. Then get out of its way. Chapter 12. The relationships that survive your growth. When you start respecting yourself, some relationships get stronger. Some fall apart immediately. The ratio tells you everything you needed to know. Most people are afraid of this ratio. They've intuited, somewhere underneath the surface, that their current relationships contain a significant portion held together by their willingness to be accommodating, available, and smaller than they're capable of being. They sense that changing those conditions will change those relationships. They're right. And so they delay the change. Not consciously, not strategically, but with the body's instinctive resistance to loss. What they haven't fully reckoned with is this. The relationships held together by their smallness are not actually relationships. They're arrangements. They're functional agreements where one party provides accommodation, availability, and emotional labor, and the other party provides presence, which gets mistaken for connection. Connection requires two people. Arrangements only require one person to show up fully, the one doing the accommodating. You've been the one doing the accommodating. The revolution starts quietly. You set a boundary that you've avoided setting. You express a preference instead of deferring. You say what you actually think in a conversation where you previously would have managed the other person's reaction by editing yourself into something more palatable. Small moves, nothing dramatic, and you watch what happens. Some people barely notice. They adjust without friction, the way healthy relationships adjust to any normal change in either person. The dynamic shifts slightly, and then finds a new equilibrium that works for both of you. These people were never invested in your smallness. They just wanted your company, and your company is still available. Better company now, actually, since you're more present and less performing. Others react. Not necessarily loudly. Sometimes just a cooler tone, a slight withdrawal, a subtle increase in the kinds of requests that previously would have produced an automatic yes. They're testing, consciously or not, whether the change is real or whether enough pressure will restore the previous arrangement. This is not malicious. It's human. You've changed the terms of something they were relying on. They're checking if the terms are actually changed. The answer, if you hold it, is the relationship. Here's what becomes available when you stop organizing your relationships around your own depletion. Genuine intimacy. Not the performed closeness of two people carefully managing each other's reactions, but the actual experience of being known, which requires being yourself, which requires enough self-respect to believe that yourself is worth being. Most people have never had this. They've had closeness that was contingent on staying agreeable, staying available, staying the version of themselves that the relationship required. They've mistaken contingent closeness for intimacy because it's the closest thing to intimacy they've experienced. But they've felt the difference, even if they haven't named it. The slight held breath before saying something real, the practiced self-editing, the performing of ease while experiencing strain. Genuine intimacy doesn't feel like that. It feels like putting something down. The people who can give you that are not people who need you to be less than you are. They're people who are doing their own work, who have developed enough internal security that your growth doesn't threaten them, your clarity doesn't embarrass them, your confidence doesn't make them smaller. They find your development interesting. They're curious about where you're going. When things go well for you, the response is clean. No ambivalence underneath it. These people exist. You will find them. But you can't find them while your life is fully occupied by arrangements masquerading as relationships. The loneliness of transition is real, and it deserves acknowledgement rather than dismissal. There's often a period, shorter for some, longer for others, between the old relationships thinning and the new ones arriving, where you are more alone than you've been in years. This period is uncomfortable enough that many people use it as evidence that growth was the wrong choice. They go back. The loneliness is not evidence of the wrong choice. It's evidence of a gap in the timeline. The gap exists because the people you haven't met yet don't know you're available, and the environments where they congregate aren't places you've been spending time. The gap closes through action, not waiting. Through deliberately placing yourself in contexts where people who share your orientation toward growth and honesty are likely to be found. This is less mystical than it sounds. People at a consistent level of self-development tend to cluster in recognizable environments. They're in rooms where skills are being built, where ideas are being seriously discussed, where people are working on something real and finding meaning in the work. You don't find them by hoping they appear. You find them by being in those rooms. When they appear, the quality of connection is immediately different from what you'd grown accustomed to. Less performance, faster honesty, a quality of ease that comes from not having to manage the other person's impression of your ambitions. You say something real, and it lands as real instead of landing as too much. The romantic dimension of this deserves specific attention because it's where the patterns are often most entrenched and the stakes feel highest. Most people choose partners from wherever they are, developmentally at the time of choosing. Which means that a relationship formed before significant growth often contains, embedded in its structure, dynamics that made sense then and no longer fit. Not because the other person is wrong, because you're both different people operating a relationship built for earlier versions of yourselves, and nobody has acknowledged that the structure needs updating. Some of those relationships can be updated. Both people can grow together in directions that continue to make them compatible. This requires both people wanting to grow, not performing willingness to grow, but actually being pulled forward by genuine curiosity and desire for development. When that's present on both sides, growth deepens the relationship rather than threatening it. You become more interesting to each other over time rather than more foreign. When it's not present on both sides, the growing person gradually becomes incomprehensible to the static one. Not because anyone failed, because divergence is what happens when two trajectories point in different directions long enough. The willingness to be alone, genuinely and without panic, is what makes all of this navigable. Not the performance of being fine with solitude, the actual capacity to be with yourself and find it sufficient. When loneliness is not an emergency, you stop making emergency decisions about relationships. You stop choosing presence over compatibility. You stop staying in arrangements that require your smallness because the alternative, a period of being alone, feels like a verdict rather than a phase. Being alone is a phase, a useful one. It's when you find out who you actually are, when no one needs you to be something specific. The relationships on the other side of that discovery are built on a different foundation. Not need, not arrangement. Not the mutual agreement to stay small enough that no one has to feel challenged. Just two people, actually themselves, actually choosing each other. That's worth the transition. Chapter 13. Making your mind difficult to break. Your mind is either something you've trained or something that runs loose. There is no third option. Most people have not trained it. They've fed it news, opinions, social comparison, ambient anxiety about things they can't control, and called that engagement. They've let it run wherever it wanted, which turns out to be mostly toward threat assessment, worst-case scenarios, and the recycling of grievances that don't resolve no matter how many times they're processed. An untrained mind is not a neutral mind. It's a mind with a negative bias built in by evolution and amplified by an information environment specifically designed to exploit that bias. Left to its own devices, It will find danger, manufacture catastrophe, and generate a level of psychological noise that makes sustained focus on anything constructive nearly impossible. Training it doesn't mean suppressing it. It means building the capacity to observe it, to notice what it's doing without being entirely governed by what it's doing. That gap between the thought and the response to the thought is where everything interesting happens. It's where resilience actually lives. The foundation of mental toughness is not hardness. People confuse these constantly. Hardness is brittle. It resists until it breaks, and then it breaks completely. Toughness is different. It's the capacity to absorb significant force and return to function. A hard person collapses under sufficient pressure because they had no flexibility built in. A tough person bends dramatically and comes back. The difference in outcome under real stress is not subtle. Building that kind of toughness starts with perspective. Not the motivational poster kind, but the practiced cognitive habit of contextualizing current difficulty within a larger frame. The meeting that went badly, the project that failed, the relationship that ended, the rejection that arrived this morning and is currently occupying your entire mental bandwidth. Each of these feels, in the moment, like it has the weight of a verdict. It doesn't. It has the weight of a moment. Moments pass. They do not define trajectories unless you let them. This is not dismissal of difficulty. The difficulty is real. The point is that your assessment of the difficulty in the immediate aftermath of experiencing it is almost always exaggerated. Your brain under stress is not producing accurate analysis. It's producing threat response, fast, catastrophizing, focused entirely on the worst possible interpretation. You're not thinking clearly. You know this in the abstract. The practical application is learning to notice when you're in that state and deliberately withhold major conclusions until you're out of it. Sleep on it. Literally. The assessment you make tomorrow morning will be different from the one you're making right now, and tomorrow mornings will be closer to accurate. The second component is emotional regulation, which is not, as it's commonly misunderstood, the suppression of emotion. Suppression doesn't work. It just relocates the emotion into behavior, where it emerges sideways and at inconvenient times, usually aimed at someone who had nothing to do with the original source. Regulation is different. It's the ability to feel something fully, the disappointment, the anger, the anxiety, without immediately converting the feeling into action. To sit with an uncomfortable emotional state long enough for it to give you its information and then subside, rather than acting from it while it's at peak intensity. This is a physical skill as much as a cognitive one. Your nervous system has its own timeline for processing emotional activation. When you try to think your way through strong emotion before the physical component has settled, you're working against the biology. You can accelerate the settling through breathing, through physical movement, through deliberate change of environment, but you can't bypass it. The people who seem emotionally steady under pressure are not experiencing less emotion. They've just developed a longer fuse between the feeling and the response. That fuse is built through practice, specifically through the repeated experience of feeling something difficult, not acting from it, and surviving the interval intact. Each time you do this, the interval becomes more tolerable. Eventually, it becomes almost comfortable. The third component is meaning-making. How you interpret what happens to you, which turns out to matter almost as much as what actually happens to you. Two people can experience the same setback and emerge with completely different psychological states, not because their circumstances are different, but because the meaning they've assigned to those circumstances is different. One person loses a significant opportunity and concludes, "This path is wrong for me. I need to reevaluate." Another concludes, "I'm not capable enough. I shouldn't have tried. Same event. Vastly different consequences for the next 10 years of behavior. The empowering interpretation is not the optimistic one. It's the accurate one, which usually turns out to be more functional than the catastrophizing one. Because catastrophizing is also inaccurate, just in the other direction. You're looking for the interpretation that's honest about what happened and still leaves you with agency. That combination, honesty plus agency, is the signature of meaning-making that produces resilience rather than resignation. It requires practice to find it, especially under pressure, when your brain is generating catastrophic interpretations faster than you can evaluate them. The practice is asking the same two questions consistently enough that they become automatic. What actually happened here, specifically? And what remains within my control? The answers to those questions reliably point toward agency, toward the next move, away from the paralysis that comes from treating circumstances as verdicts. The fourth component is narrative control. You have a running story about who you are, your capabilities, your limitations, your relationship with difficulty, your track record with commitment. That story was written partly by experience and partly by interpretation of experience, which means a significant portion of it was authored by your worst moments rather than your representative ones. The failures were memorable. The quiet competencies accumulated in between were less memorable. The story skews negative by default. Conscious narrative editing is not self-deception. It's accuracy correction. You're not telling yourself things that aren't true. You're insisting that the full picture be represented, rather than the selectively negative one your untrained mind prefers. You have overcome difficult things before. You have made commitments and kept them. You have been afraid and proceeded anyway. These are facts. They belong in the story. When the story includes them, difficulty stops feeling like an anomaly and starts feeling like a familiar country, one you visited and navigated before and are capable of navigating again. Stress inoculation is the final piece, and it's the most counterintuitive. The way to become more resilient is not to protect yourself from difficulty. It's to seek out manageable difficulty deliberately, building up a track record of surviving increasingly uncomfortable things. Each survived discomfort is evidence. Evidence accumulates. The account grows. Navy SEALs call this getting comfortable being uncomfortable. It's not an extreme sport metaphor. It's a description of how psychological capacity actually expands through repeated exposure to controlled stress, building confidence not in the absence of difficulty, but in your ability to function within it. You don't need SEAL training. You need the difficult conversation you've been avoiding, the challenging goal you've been circling, the uncomfortable situation you've been postponing. Each one you walk through is a training session. Each one leaves you with more capacity than you had before. The mental fortress isn't built from stone. It's built from all the things you've already survived and the quiet knowledge accumulated over time that surviving difficulty is something you do. That knowledge doesn't announce itself dramatically. It just sits underneath everything, steady and available. And on the days when something genuinely hard arrives, you find it there, already present, already sufficient. Chapter 14. You are building something. Your life right now is not happening to you. It's the accumulated result of thousands of small decisions you don't remember making. This lands differently depending on where you are. If things are going well, it's satisfying. Evidence that your choices have been working, that the architecture is sound, that you've been building something without fully realizing it. If things aren't going well, it's uncomfortable. It removes the explanation that circumstances are responsible. It puts the authorship back where it actually belongs, Most people prefer the explanation, the circumstances, the economy, the timing, the people who didn't come through, the breaks that didn't go their way. These are real factors. They're just not the primary ones. The primary ones are the decisions, the standards you've held or abandoned, the environments you've chosen or tolerated, the behaviors you've made automatic or left to chance. Those are the architecture of your current reality. Everything else is weather. Taking responsibility for that architecture is not the same as blaming yourself for everything. It's not self-flagellation. It's a practical reorientation from someone things happen to, towards someone who shapes what happens. The difference in available action between those two positions is enormous. The person things happen to can wait, adapt, endure. The person who shapes what happens can design, adjust, build. You are always building something. The question is whether you're building it consciously. The first principle of conscious reality creation is environmental design, and it operates at every scale, from the physical arrangement of your workspace to the social environment you spend the most time in, to the information environment you've constructed around yourself. Physical environment shapes behavior in ways most people dramatically underestimate. Cluttered space produces fragmented attention. This is not metaphor, it's neuroscience. Your visual field competes for cognitive resources. Every object that doesn't belong generates a small, low-level processing demand. Accumulated across a workspace, across a morning, those demands add up to a meaningful reduction in available focus. Cleaning your desk is not procrastination. Sometimes it's the most leveraged thing you can do before starting work. The information environment is where most people have the least conscious control and the most to gain from imposing some. What you consume shapes what you think about. What you think about shapes what you notice. What you notice shapes what you do. The chain is long enough that the connection between what you read at 7 in the morning and the decision you make at 3 in the afternoon is invisible. But it's there. Most people's information diet is determined by what algorithms serve them, which is determined by what produces the most engagement, which is determined by what triggers the strongest emotional response, which is predominantly threat, outrage, and social comparison. You are being fed a carefully optimized diet of things that make you feel anxious, inferior, and certain that the world is more dangerous than it is. This is not neutral. It is actively shaping your psychology in directions that serve the platforms and harm you. Curating your information environment is not intellectual cowardice. It's hygiene. The second principle is relationship curation, which has been discussed but deserves revisiting here in the context of conscious construction. The people around you are not just company. They are, in aggregate, the standard against which your brain calibrates what's normal, possible, and worth pursuing. This calibration happens automatically and constantly. You don't decide to adopt the standards of your reference group. You absorb them, which means choosing your reference group is one of the highest leverage decisions available to you. Not because you need to surround yourself with successful people to absorb their success by proximity. That's a shallow version of the idea. Because you need to surround yourself with people whose relationship with growth, honesty, and effort represents the standard you're trying to normalize for yourself. If everyone around you treats ambition as slightly embarrassing, ambition will feel slightly embarrassing to you no matter how much you intellectually endorse it. If everyone around you treats continuous learning as normal, you will find it easier to make continuous learning normal. The environment does the work that willpower can't sustain. The third principle is opportunity creation, the proactive construction of conditions that make good things more likely rather than the passive waiting for good things to arrive. Luck, examined closely, tends to follow a pattern. It concentrates around people who are prepared, positioned, and paying attention in the right places. Not because they're luckier in any cosmic sense, because they've created conditions where the things they're looking for are more likely to appear, and because they're capable of recognizing them when they do, and moving quickly enough to take advantage. Preparation is obvious. Positioning is less discussed. Positioning means being in the rooms, the conversations, the environments where the things you want to find are likely to be. It means being visible to the people who might be useful to you and being useful to them first. It means building a reputation, not through performance but through consistent delivery, that precedes you into rooms you haven't entered yet. Most opportunities don't arrive through front doors. They arrive through conversations that started as something else, through relationships that began in unlikely contexts, through the accumulated residue of showing up consistently over time in places that mattered. You can't engineer the specific opportunity. You can engineer the conditions that make opportunities likely. The fourth principle is feedback optimization. Treating your life as a system that generates data and using that data to improve the system. This requires measurement, which most people avoid because measurement makes performance visible, and visible performance is uncomfortable when it reveals a gap between intention and result. The gap is not the problem. The gap is the information. The gap tells you exactly where the system needs adjustment. Without measurement, you're flying blind, which feels safer because you can maintain whatever story you prefer about how things are going. With measurement, you lose the story and gain the leverage. What gets measured gets improved. Not because measurement is magical, because it removes ambiguity. You can't tell yourself you've been consistent about something when the log shows you haven't. You can't pretend the approach is working when the numbers show it isn't. The honesty is uncomfortable and also, completely, the point. The fifth principle is compound leverage. Identifying the specific actions that create disproportionate returns and investing in those rather than spreading effort evenly across everything. Not all actions are equal. Some produce linear returns. You put in an hour, you get an hour's worth of output. Others produce compounding returns. You put in an hour, and that hour makes every subsequent hour more effective. Communication skills, emotional intelligence, the ability to think clearly under pressure, the capacity to build trust quickly. These are not peripheral nice-to-haves. They are foundational multipliers that improve the return on everything else you do. The person who can communicate clearly is more effective in every role they'll ever inhabit. The person who can manage their emotional state under pressure will outperform an equally talented person who can't, across every high-stakes situation they encounter. The person who can build genuine trust quickly will have access to collaboration, information, and opportunity that equally skilled people who can't build trust will never see. Investing in leverage points is not glamorous. The work of improving communication doesn't feel like strategy. The work of developing emotional intelligence doesn't feel like progress towards specific goals. It feels like general improvement in an unquantifiable area. But the returns compound quietly across every domain simultaneously, and after enough time, the person who invested in leverage is operating in a different category from the person who didn't. The conscious builder is not someone with a perfect plan. They're someone who understands the principles well enough to keep making decisions that trend in the right direction, who keeps the environment aligned with their development, keeps the relationships supportive of their growth, keeps showing up in positions where good things are likely to happen, keeps measuring what matters, keeps investing in what multiplies. Over time, the accumulation of those decisions becomes something visible, something that looks, from the outside, like the product of exceptional circumstances or unusual talent. From the inside, It looks like exactly what it is. Work, chosen deliberately, sustained long enough to compound. You were always building something. Now you know what you're building. Here's the part nobody tells you about focusing on yourself. Eventually, it stops being about you. Not immediately. At the start, it's entirely about you, rebuilding what was depleted, clarifying what was borrowed, strengthening what was neglected. That work is necessary, and it is not selfish. It is the prerequisite for everything that follows. What follows is this: you become someone whose presence actually helps. Not because you're performing helpfulness, because you have something real to give. Clarity, stability, genuine capability. The quiet authority of someone who has done the internal work, rather than just talking about it. The people around you feel the difference. They may not name it. They feel it. Every person who watches you build yourself, who sees you move from depletion to capacity, from borrowed identity to genuine one, from accommodation to authentic presence, receives something from that. Proof that the thing is possible. Permission to want it for themselves. Your development is not a private transaction. It radiates. This is why focusing on yourself is not the opposite of generosity. It is, done correctly, the highest form of it. You came here depleted. You leave with a blueprint. Now build something worth seeing.